Now, David Cameron recently quoted, "Tourism is another industry we should get behind. The rewards for growth here are immense. If you just consider this, for every 0.5% increase in our share of the world tourism market, we can add £2.7 billion to our economy and an extra 50,000 jobs." That's what our Prime Minister recently said. Now, in order to assess how we can increase our market share by even just 0.5%, we have to be smarter and we have to be much more intelligent in terms of how we compete in what we hope has already been established as a very sophisticated, competitive international playing field. But in order to be genuinely ready, in the phrase of ready, set, go, we have to understand more about what is actually happening on the international competitive scene. And that's the first session of this summit, is to really understand what is happening on that international platform. Now, the next session will actually help us by really enlightening some of the key examples of competitive behavior across the world. And to lead this panel, we have the chairman of Visit Britain, Christopher Rodrigues, who will be leading the debate. Now, Christopher actually passed me a little note a moment ago, which didn't say, but I'm going to add to the note, please help me to really work out on the panel, so be active and really help him to work out hard, because actually he's participating in the royal pageant on Sunday. He's rowing, which is phenomenal. He's one of the 18 people rowing the Gloriana on Sunday. Good luck with that, Christopher. But first and foremost, good luck with the panel.
Thank you, Ufi. I think that calls for a blistering performance. It certainly will be on Sunday. 60 years ago, just before the Queen came to the throne, Hillary and Tenzing climbed Everest. And in one sense, that's a metaphor for what we're all about. Hillary famously said that when he got to the base station and realized, as he looked down, that he had come a long way, he then looked up and realized he had a long way to go. And that's exactly what a number of the speakers have already indicated, and what I think true about our industry. There has been tremendous progress, but we have a considerable challenge ahead because the game is getting tougher. It's great that TripAdvisor, we like TripAdvisor when it makes London the #1 city in the world. We knew that already, but they've officially said so. So we won't question those statistics. But sometimes you have to put our endeavor into context. Not a lot of people, as Michael Caine would say, not a lot of people know that our inbound volume in this country from the US has fallen by 25% in the last decade. Still a lot of spending, still our biggest market. But it's not a perfect place to be. Continental Europe has continued to be a very important part of our inbound business. But you know that there are some questions about the euro. And whatever happens in that market, you can't be certain that Europe will carry us forward on its own. Asia and Latin America are places where we have to establish our attractiveness. Who would have thought 5 years ago or 10 years ago that Brazil would now be our 5th biggest long-haul market? How many people in this room have got a real strategy for Brazil? We need one. The secret to this is partnership. The secret to this is understanding what the competition is doing. And I'm going to ask two people to join me on the panel so we can have a discussion about what is happening overseas and what the competition is doing. First, Taleb Rifai, the Secretary General of the UNWTO, and also David Scowsill, the Chief Executive of WTTC. Gentlemen. you're in a very special position, and I've had the privilege of working with both of you for some time, and I know how committed you are to tourism as an industry. But your eyes roam not only over what we do in the UK, but over what's happening around the world. So it would be great to have some perspective from you. So maybe, David, you might like to start by just saying how, as a Brit who's worked around the world, who leads the leading global industry association, how does the UK stack up, and what's going on around the world that we should be cognizant of that might give us a challenge that we have to overcome?
Well, I think if you look at some of the headwinds that the UK industry has to deal with, macro ones, visas not part of the Schengen Agreement, it's difficult to get them. APD, another issue. Infrastructure at Heathrow, VAT is very high relative to other countries. Yet despite all of those difficulties, the UK industry is still growing, but it's not growing nearly as fast as it could do if you resolve some of those macro things. And I think if I pick up on one of the things that Ufi was saying, one of the things that I observe in the UK is that the industry itself is not very coordinated in its approach to the government. And some of the things that Taleb and I see in other countries, the private sector is much better at coordinating across airlines, tour operators, hoteliers, GDS businesses, to give very clear macro messages to the government. I don't think that happens very well here.
And is that, from your perspective, what's the catalyst? Is fewer, simpler messages prioritized? Is that what's
Yes,
what's
it is,
working?
but it's events like this, it's where the leaders of the industry get together and agree what are the top 3 or 4 messages that the government really needs to understand. Now, the difficulty we have in this country is if there's an Icelandic ash cloud, call for Willie Walsh, let's talk about that. If customers are stranded in Mallorca, let's talk to Peter Long from the tour operating side. It's not joined up. And there are some very big things that the industry needs to deal with the government. Take visas, APD and infrastructure at Heathrow just being 3, which is common to the entire industry. And if there's a mechanism in this country of getting the leaders of the associations and the private sector together in a public-private discussion with the government, then you have a chance. Then you have a chance.
I suspect not just, I mean, one of the things we need to focus on is this is not just a London audience. And Kit spoke very eloquently about what's happening in London, and it's absolutely true that it's a major gateway. But I think from our perspective, the other thing we have to do is make sure we distribute the largesse of tourism around the country, which has always been a challenge. And one of the things I think we have to add there is a regional airport strategy as well as a London strategy. We need both, because with the changing power of the global alliances, frankly, it's as important that Edinburgh is connected with Frankfurt as it is that Edinburgh has connections down with Heathrow. We need to remember that we have a whole country to serve.
Yes, I mean, when Taleb's made a few comments, I'll show you something on a video about how the US has attacked this particular issue and how the US is getting better. Still not perfect, but getting better at dealing with the Obama administration.
Taleb, you've had a career in Jordan. You've had an international career with the ILO. You took on 2009 UNWTO. 2010 you took on UNWTO, and you have been ceaseless in your travels. At some point in time, I want you to talk to me about what's really happening with Mugabe, because I don't believe the stories I read in the press.
More than happy to do that.
But hold that. We'll come back to that at the end as a closing moment. Let's talk about what you're seeing in governments, because there's joined up in this in an industry, but there's also a question of whether governments are joined up. But what are you seeing? What's best practice look like?
Well, first of all, let's acknowledge some of the major changes that are happening on the global scene, because without seeing the bigger picture, we won't be able to see where we fit within that picture. The world is changing tremendously. In 1952, when Queen Elizabeth, which we are celebrating Jubilee today, tomorrow, the day after, there were only 25 million travelers internationally crossing borders in 1 year. We're having now 1 billion. 1 billion. At that time, less than 15% of world travelers would go to developing countries. This major change, this major shift towards the emerging destinations has been incredibly, incredibly huge. And it's a reflection of shifting powers in this world, and we need to acknowledge that. We can't, as a developed society, take things for granted anymore. We're now at almost 50-50 between the developed destinations and the emerging destinations. The Chinas, the Russias, the Indias, the Brazils of the world are becoming the best performers in growth, the best source markets of the world. Brazil, you mentioned, grew at 52% last year. China and Russia, 27, 28%. These new players have to be taken into account. When we talk about increasing our market share, actually we have to come to terms with the fact that by 2015, the world will be divided between emerging destinations and developing destinations equally, 50-50. So this is a major change that we need to reckon with, and we can never, ever take ourselves for granted. Those destinations that are well established historically and strong and going. The second thing is travelers of the world are changing. They're changing tremendously, and we need to follow the patterns of that. The third most important change that we need to reckon with, which goes back to your question, and I'm sorry I took a bit of a long detour to come to your answer, is how much does government really pay attention to something like travel and tourism? For a long time, travel and tourism was only associated with leisure, good things in life. It's easy to tax travel like you tax tobacco and alcohol because it's something that people can do without. It's not that anymore. And ironically, the governments that are picking up this fact and this reality that 1 out of 12 jobs all over the world are created by our industry is the developing world. They're paying much more attention and taking much more serious. We heard now from our Chinese diplomat about this. It's amazing. It's amazing how much countries like China, like Turkey, like Croatia even, countries like even Russia now are picking up all this rhythm. India, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, Mexico. I mean, we were together there. So we need to be quite aware of what's going on around the world. Otherwise, we will be missing on a lot.
If you take, I mean, Taleb and I spent a lot of time talking to heads of state about the impact of travel and tourism. And we'll talk about this thing called the Golden Book, which is where we go to heads of state with an open letter, which they receive, and it describes the impact of travel and tourism in their country, jobs, GDP growth, investment. And typically we have 20, 30 minutes with these presidents and prime ministers. 10 minutes is very public, where they stand up and talk about the impact of the industry. And then 20 minutes is, frankly, us lecturing them very politely about the key things they really need to understand. And it could be anything from hotel inward investment through to sorting out air traffic control systems or common visas for a number of countries, those kinds of things. And I wanted to show something that was happening in the US. We'll show a video in a second, which was an example of how the industry in the US got together collectively to talk to the Obama administration about why the US had lost $600 billion of income since 9/11. So perhaps we can show that video.
No question that we are an industry that is overtaxed and undervalued.
We've got to make governments truly understand the power of our organization.
President of Mexico.
And I realize how important it is to be here.
Partnerships that we have formed with this organization, I believe, are going to be key.
You have the Transportation Secretary here.
And until you're out there talking to people,
Get 2 cabinet secretaries, plus one of the president's top advisors.
Greetings from President Obama.
We get it. We think all of you contribute a lot to our economy.
It's my great pleasure to be here and meet friends.
Now we can see Obama's response to that in maybe 5 or 10 minutes, Chris. But the point of that was that the US doesn't have a Secretary of Tourism either. And the only person that can take the judgment call between Homeland Security, who's trying to keep people out of the US, and the State Department that's not issuing visas fast enough, and the Commerce Department, who absolutely want to replace that $600 billion and grow it some, the only person that can make that judgment is ultimately Obama. But it's taken the industry there about 2 years to get him to even think about it.
I mean, I think we need an important balance here between understanding what's happening overseas and not doing a British flail over the shoulder all the time. Just for the audience, not insignificantly, yesterday we had a Visit Britain board with Nick Baird, who runs UK Trade and Investment, and one of the senior people from the Foreign Office, and there is now more joined-uppedness. The real question becomes, we've agreed that we all have the same issue. We need to get visas fixed. The question now becomes whether we can get policy changes. But I think there is some progress. And to pick up on Ufi's point, John Penrose and Jeremy Hunt have, in my experience, when I came into office, Colin Marshall, my predecessor, said you won't get the government to listen about tourism at all. And collectively, you guys have made a difference. The question now is, don't give up when you're just beginning to have an impact. Raise the game and put more pressure on. Taleb.
Yes, I think we're beginning to see some positive movements. The issues that David was referring to in the United States are really significant. I was delighted really to hear John Penrose this morning. I mean, we need more stands like this, especially in Europe and among the mature destinations, because we don't hear much of that. Most of our political leaders are so engulfed in so many other aspects of the economy, and they're missing on what is part of the solution as opposed to be part of the problem.
So we were together in Florianopolis when Lula da Silva said it's 60 million jobs, and that's the issue that
that's
the
the
G20
issue.
has
That's
to get.
particularly the issue. But just to go back on some of the very basic logical things. You know, you're paying so much money on promoting Britain, asking people to come to the UK. That's coming from the exchequer. And you're paying just as much, if not more money, from the same budget to tell people don't come to the UK. I mean, make up your minds. What is it? It's a very simple. It's a very simple logical thing, and I think we're now beginning to see some awareness about this.
I agree with you. When you see countries like the US, where there now finally appears to be a joined-up solution, because the executive order does reach out to all of those people who we saw. It does get Hillary Clinton charged with changing things, and it's a scary sight when Hillary Clinton gets a mind to do something, it happens. How do you see people getting that joined-uppedness across government? Because the challenge for any minister of tourism, and we've all seen the ministers, they all actually have the same challenge, which is tourism sitting over there. It's about people having margaritas on the beach. It's the fun job. John's made huge progress, but we need border agency. We need education. We need Home Office. We need people to look sideways. And the thing about the executive order was it said, I want a pan-government solution. That's what the Deputy Secretary said. It's a pan-government solution. What gets that to happen in places like Mexico and places like the US?
Look, first of all, it's a challenge to have a dedicated public administration for tourism. It's always either mushed up with something else, or it's so low on the government hierarchy. So there is no really voice within the public decision-making system for that. But even once you get something like this, tourism ministers and heads of tourism administrations are very lonely ministers, extremely, because their success is so much in the hands of so many others. Their infrastructure, trade, finance, interior, borders, whatever you have. So that's why we both came up with the conclusion that unless we really target the heads of states, unless we really make them wake up to see that you have to make everybody sensitive to this very important industry and coordinate a coherent policy where whatever you do here affects there and is calculated at least. I mean, we're not telling people don't raise taxes. You know, taxes are a fact of life. But when you do something like this, measure its impact on travel and tourism, because travel and tourism matters, because it creates so many jobs. I mean, it's a very, very simple logic. So the direct question to your answer is we have to target the heads of states and the heads of governments. That's the only way. And you have to get instructions and orders and directives from the top, going to everybody and tell them.
So it's joined up government.
It is, absolutely.
Absolutely, this is the benchmark of whether you do joined-up government.
Yeah. So that's why the two initiatives we're talking about. First of all, the targeting of heads of states. We've issued an open letter to every head of state all over the world telling them, please support the travel and tourism industry within your administration and give it enough engine to go through. Secondly, we've targeted one of the most powerful groups now that have emerged in the last 2 years as a de facto group that is entrusted with the way the world economy is going, which is the G20. Since April of 2010, in the meeting here in London, it has become clear that this group of 20 powerful nations, that is a very realistic combination of strong, traditional, developed economies and the new players of the world, the new BRICS of the world, are coming together and making a decision. And that's why we targeted them. And we have managed, finally, Mexico, you were there with us, to come up with a very, very strong declaration that President Calderón of Mexico, as president of the G20, after 4 consecutive attempts to do something, is going to carry the message of travel and tourism to the 20 G20 leaders, which will meet in Mexico again. Now, is that going to make a difference? Probably very little, but it's a beginning. We're beginning at least to...
It's the first time that tourism is on the G20 agenda.
It's the first time ever. It would be even mentioned there on their agenda. As I said, tourism is always connected to things that are not so vital.
Yeah, it's a huge first step because
very huge.
In the course of 15 months, Taleb has been to 28, I think, heads of state. I've been to about half of them, and we've covered a lot of mileage. What happened in Mexico is very significant because you had the tourism ministers of the G20 countries who came up with a declaration that President Calderón, as the chair of G20, is going to put in front of Obama and Cameron and all the other G20 leaders. And all it does is talks about jobs and investment and the visa issue. And visa facilitation, and some research we did recently, shows that if we remove some of these visa issues around the G20 countries, small changes, you could stimulate another 5 million jobs in about a 3-year period. Why don't we listen to President Calderón in a second, because he's a real tourism visionary. What he's done in his country is absolutely espouse travel and tourism, and he's changed laws, he's had a national agreement, all the state governors are lined up implementing a country-wide approach to travel and tourism. And he's taking all of this into the G20. So let's hear what President Calderón has to say.
He speaks like as if he's one of us, really, as if he would be here and saying the same things.
So you can run that video.
This is one of the most important international business organizations for the tourism industry, which is vital for the Mexican economy. I congratulate you for your commitment and the work you are doing. As you know, the world economy is going through difficult times. This year, Mexico is president of the G20, made up of the leading economies in the world. One of the main priorities is to facilitate global economic recovery and set the foundations for future growth and employment. And I'm convinced that the tourism industry plays a key role in this. Today, travel and tourism generate more than 170 million jobs in G20 economies. But if industry and governments work together, there is potential to create almost 50 million more jobs in the next decade. Tourism can be a driver for global recovery.
I just want to pick up one related point, come back to you, which for all of us in the room, we see leaders of other nations. Cameron has made his speech. I really would urge everyone to continue the efforts that you're already making to carry the message to your MPs. Before Boris was in power, I had a meeting with Ken who said, do you know what I think about tourism? I don't care about tourism. Tourists don't vote. That's when I picked myself off the floor thinking this was going to be a pretty short meeting. He then went on to say, astutely, but I care about the people who put me in office who depend upon tourism. Yeah. And Kit, bless him, is talking about a mayor who does get this point. But if our local MPs don't get the message and don't carry that message back to government, then we suffer from the fact that tourists are overseas, they don't vote, so I don't have to worry about them. But you do have to worry about people from Bognor and Bridlington who depend upon tourism, domestic and international. And that's a bridge that we all have to make and can't just be made by this. We've got a few minutes to go, so let's...
Well, let me just pick up on a couple of things related to China, because we don't go through all the statistical data that Mr. Chong has outlined. But it is impossible for people to understand the enormity of what's going on there, other than to say it was 58 million outbound in 2010, it's now 70 million, and out of that 70 million, the UK at the moment is only getting 370,000. So I think Germany is 9 times the size of UK inbound for Chinese. But the main thing for the Chinese is that the infrastructure development, the 5 and 10 year planning cycles, the amounts of airports they are building, you know, they produce 10 or 12 new airports every year. And that investment and that long-term thinking, compared with some of the infrastructure difficulties we have in Europe, is very impressive. And it is very clearly one of their pillars of growth.
And one thing that, a little bit about what VB does, not as a PR thing, but we had a VB board yesterday, and we absolutely decided that whilst the normal planning cycle is given to us by the government, which is the next CSR, Comprehensive Spending Review cycle, we are going to do a plan through to 2020, because we are not interested in anymore in what happens within the money we've got. We need a set of goals that are long-term goals, which is one of the things I think we see in these successful countries that are raising their game. They are not just doing short-term budget planning. They're doing long-term planning to raise the standards of their tourism industry and support it and make it more competitive. And that's what we're up against.
You know, just maybe one more thing before we close, because I know time is tight, is the concept of us working together has taken out a completely new dimension here. At a time where destinations, let's say around a very, very affluent region like the Mediterranean, which is 30% of world tourism in and out, used to compete with each other. Now the Mediterranean altogether has to compete with Southeast Asia or with Central America, with the Caribbeans and all of that. So the whole concept of entities adjacent to each other, seeing next door neighbors as competitors now will have to change. The world is acting in a different way. Groups are coming together incredibly. The 10 countries of ASEAN in Southeast Asia are forming a powerful alliance now where they say, come, visit one of us, then you'll visit the other. Multi-destinations, common visas, the Caribbean, Central America. You should look at the Schengen zone as part of that. So basically, I hope we come to realize the changes that are happening in the world today.
As Calderon said, if you have an American visa, you can come to Mexico. That's
Something
the end
like that.
That's the visa policy in Mexico.
And those are big decisions. You know,
that's a huge decision.
It suits the Caribbean when the cricket's on to allow people to have one Caribbean entry point and then trot around the islands. Once the cricket finishes, it stops. Yeah. So you need much more joined-up thinking about
Let's
these
close
issues.
by looking at, just talking about Obama and maybe
and
looking at his
I
video.
think if there's one message for me to leave with this gathering, it's within the UK there has got to be a better way of coming together as an industry to face off to government on the big issues, on taxation, on infrastructure, and on visas. And for 2 years, the industry has done this in the US, so the chief executives of the airlines, the hotel groups, the GDS businesses, the OTAs, have effectively worked very cooperatively together to get to a point, as Ufi said, that Obama finally Hillary Clinton ordered an executive order to speed up the visa processing for Brazil and China. Not difficult. Return on investment, you put another consular office in comes the revenue. So they finally got the message through. Now, let's hope Obama's still there after November, but let's hear what he has to say now.
Tourism is the #1 service we export, and that's because we've got a great product to sell. Every year, tens of millions of visitors come to places like the Grand Canyon, the Golden Gate Bridge, and Disney World. They rent cars, stay in hotels, eat at restaurants, and check out the sights. They add billions of dollars to our economy, and that helps support jobs all across the country. I want more of these tourists to come visit. I want America to be the top tourist destination in the world. That's why, earlier this year, we joined with business leaders to find better ways to market our tourist destinations and to make sure foreign visitors get the information they need. We're also protecting our borders while trying to make it easier for tourists from more countries to visit without a visa. And we're speeding up visa processing in countries like China and Brazil, so more people can come spend their money.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've seen what President Obama is doing. I hope you have not thought that Britain is nowhere. It isn't nowhere. As Bill Bryson writes, it is quite extraordinary that this tiny little island is where it is, right at the top of the global tourism industry. Our message is not that we should panic. Our message, and the message that Taleb and David, I think, have really underscored, is that if we stand still, we will slide backwards. Standards are rising, the game is getting hotter, we have to raise our game, and I will simply say, briefly on behalf of Visit Britain, we would love to be part of that. We are part of that, and our job is not to tell you what to do, but is to work with you. And over the next few months, you will see how we hope to do that as the smoke clears from the Olympics, the excitement, and we return to being an industry that, having had the best showcasing opportunity that anyone could ever have asked for, has to be the industry that takes advantage of that opportunity and turns it into, as Tessa Jowell said when she appointed me and asked, what matters in this place? Heads in beds, bums in seats, and feet through the turnstiles. That is the business we're in. Thank you, and please thank our guests.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.